Hello.
Go live. Are we in focus? We're good.
Is that angle right today?
Well, the screen is definitely crooked, but
the angle's perfect.
I think we're perfect.
I love it. Welcome.
Hello. We are here at the Red Couch Theology podcast, and we're going to talk about Easter and resurrection.
Yeah, we are.
Which we started talking about last week.
We did sneakily talk about it in the field of quantum mechanics.
Yes.
I believe, which you love.
I love. We could talk about it another hour.
Join us on the Red Couch Quantum Mechanics podcast.
Yes, except for I learned something. Well, you had a story to tell about that from Sunday, but I also have a story to tell about that from Sunday.
Well, I was simply saying in my, somewhere randomly connected brain, there is a joy. I kind of linked quantum mechanics to the possibility of resurrection. Not that the two are connected directly, but just that really perhaps the one thing we learn from a field like quantum mechanics, which in one sentence is what?
Wait, sorry. What did we learn from quantum mechanics?
No. What in one sentence is quantum mechanics? If people thought they tuned into a theology podcast and didn't realize they needed to know about quantum mechanics.
Well, quantum mechanics, I don't know. I don't usually use that term.
So that was the term I was told to use?
Yeah, that might be correct. And I'm definitely, I always search for quantum physics when I'm studying it.
What is quantum physics?
So quantum physics is just physics at the quantum level.
What's the quantum level?
Very, very small things.
Okay, there we go. So if you're unsure and you came to a theology
physics
podcast and
at the
feel
very,
like
very small
you need a working scientific knowledge, it's very, very small stuff. So I started trying to talk about this and looked across the room and happened to notice someone I know who has a PhD in quantum mechanics and had this moment of like, oh, what am I doing here?
Right after putting up a quote from one of the leading quantum physicists that it's not understandable.
Yeah.
And then you said, I just tried to explain it. And then you look out and there's like someone there who's got a degree in it.
I was like, oh my goodness, this is why preaching's such a dangerous activity when you try and bring in other fields.
Totally. And then my story is the first person I talked to in the lobby afterwards was a guest of one of our members, or actually it was his son, who's a quantum physicist. And I'm like, I was like, so how did Alex do? And he's like, yeah, it was like really helpful illustration and stuff. You know, you got one little thing backwards the way he described it or something like that. But it was like, he's like, yeah, it was still useful. It was really helpful. Anyway, but then of course, I'm a nerd. Like an idiot, I decide I should talk to this guy about all of my knowledge.
I love it.
And I started talking and I was like, he's looking at me like, I love that this guy thinks he knows what he's talking about. So maybe we shouldn't talk about it because the reality is just because I've spent way too many nerdy hours on YouTube watching video after video after video after video, even part of a lecture series from Princeton, I still have no clue what I'm talking about.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Like, the phrase, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing.
Yes.
And I feel like there's so many areas that I have a little bit of knowledge on.
You're just a really dangerous man.
Yeah. And I feel like I can talk about like car mechanics in a way that kind of makes it sound like I know what I'm doing.
I can definitely not do that.
But I'm useless. Really?
I might be able to name a couple fancy items in a car. Catalytic converter.
Oh, that is a fancy item.
Look out.
Apparently it's so fancy that people steal them now regularly. So watch out for that. But it just, I just feel like there's a bluff that you can play. I actually bought a book once called Bluff Your Way Through Rugby. And it gives you like all of the knowledge you need to pretend that you know how to play and even that you have played seriously at some point. Like there's a whole bunch of questions as to why someone would do that. Like what identity crisis is going on that you need to convince yourself convince people you played a dangerous sport at some point. So we're all very broken people is I think the answer. But sometimes an area grabs our interest and you really do deep dive as you really do with this. But again, catching up to like expert level. And we would have no expectation that a quantum physicist would be able to sit with us and sort of go through like why or how we put church services together and chord progression in worship songs or et cetera, and yet.
I don't know. Maybe they do fine. Those guys are so wicked smart.
CDG, how hard can it be?
That's right. Yeah, let's be honest. Let's be honest here. No. Yeah. So you talked about that and got a little nervous in the middle of the message when you saw. But what was the point? The why behind the what? I think we got the stamp of approval, at least from the physicist I talked to. We got the stamp of approval on the principle.
Yes, even with some Easter generosity. Did our lights just nearly go off? Quantum mechanics.
Did our lights just get brighter?
The lights are moving like a wave. I don't know.
Are they a particle?
I don't know. One of the two. So the point was really landing on like there's mysteries to science that are still unexplainable. 100 years after the mystery was first discovered.
Yeah.
Like the question of why does space, time, et cetera, operate like this? We're like, we don't know. The universe is so much bigger than we can comprehend. And then there's this thing in play that I have a baseline understanding of called the observer effect. Somehow observing something happen changes it. Not just for you as an experience, but actually changes it in the world.
I think maybe that's where he
was. I was like
question.
Okay.
I didn't ask. I started to get so nervous talking to the guy that I just sort of slowly backed away.
Oh, I've got something to do.
Like the clip of Homer Simpson backing. Yeah. That's kind of
into the head chair.
I was like, I have other people that are not as smart as you to talk to right now. But I don't know for sure.
I have some complicated chord structures to go memorize.
I do know that at least that's debated highly for physicists to say, like a true physicist is going to say absolutely not. Like that can't be what's actually happening. So there's got to be other theories for why.
Okay.
Like there's something about the measurement tool that is changing the experiment. It's obviously not the observation of it. Because if you're holding to a totally naturalistic, more of a classical physics framework, you can't appeal to that.
Yes.
There's got to be cause and effect. There's every action has a equal and opposite reaction. All these kinds of things.
That was in Hamilton, wasn't it? Every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
I'm not sure Hamilton coined it.
It wasn't. Okay.
But it might have been Hamilton. I'm pretty sure that's Einstein or someone of his equivalent brain.
Which is hilarious because he came after Hamilton.
Yeah.
Or was it Newton? Maybe Newton was.
Well, let's be honest. Hamilton, the musical, did not come. Okay.
Oh man.
Yeah. Okay.
So broadly speaking, the hope on Easter was rather than to say I'm going to try and prove resurrection to a group of people that includes some skeptics on Easter, but just to try and land in like, oh wow, is this as impossible as science or more scientific people or people that come from an atheistic scientific point of view? Is it more possible than those people let on? And I think that's fascinating philosophically, because we might say on the people listening to this podcast and you and I, so all 10 of us or whatever, no, it's more than that, but like that group of people, like say out of that group, 95% of us land in the category that would say, I want to believe in something. Surprisingly to people like us, there's a whole other group of people that would say, if I'm honest, I don't want to believe in something. And so I actually read a quote from a guy called Thomas Hegel, who's a philosopher who would not describe himself, he's Jewish in background, would not describe himself as theistic at all. And he says, the same fear that a theist or a believer in God has that smart people are atheists, I have about the multiple people I know that I know are very smart and also have a religious faith. So we as a group of people that are somewhat wired to say, no, I believe and I want to keep believing, there's a whole other group of people that were like, no, I actively don't want to believe. And so trying to create some sense of like, have you ever thought about what's really possible? Like, isn't it funny to think that the same doubts people that are more religious faith orientated might have about like, wow, am I crazy? Like, is there really a God out there that loves me and cares about me? People that come from an atheist sort of framework are like, oh no, like, what if there is? Like, is that possible? Like, the doubt works both ways.
Yes.
So I just was hoping to create a little bit more sense of like what's possible.
Yeah, I'm like sitting here resisting the urge to bring up like 5 more physics examples of this.
Of things that like...
we should talk about the event horizon of black holes, because that's another massive problem.
Absolutely, we should. There's a great movie
what
about...
What happens to objects that fall into a black hole? Anyway, sorry.
They go off into a movie and end up in hell. Have you not seen Event Horizon?
No.
Isn't that a documentary? I don't know.
They go to hell?
That's what happens in Event Horizon, I think, if I remember rightly.
Maybe spoiler alert.
Yeah, Event Horizon's at least 20. It's at least 25 years old. Like, it's like...
If is it a spoiler alert if you're only about 50% confident that the spoiler you're giving is accurate?
No, I don't think it is. I don't think you need to worry. But you mentioned one to me that was centered around like how different atoms interact with each other, right?
Quantum entanglement.
Yeah, that it's faster than the speed of light, which for years
there's
was
either some sort of communicate,
yeah,
or they're being changed by the observation.
And you can look exactly, and then you can look at a whole bunch of other things, like somehow in a forest, a tree can be attacked by a specific type of bug, and it can let a tree 100 yards away know that this is the case, and it can secrete some kind of thing to resist or to drive the bug away. Somehow it communicates over that distance with no way of us knowing how. There's a whole mysteriousness to the universe that's truly compelling. And so sometimes as 21st century people, I think what happens is we get so locked into our routine of school runs and work life and checking social media that we start to think, oh, there is no mystery to the world anymore. We get news from across the world in seconds, and we start to say we know how the world works. And we're kind of beyond any sense of like the supernatural and resurrection. Yet everything about the deep sciences, the real sciences, tells us, no, there's so much mystery. And so this story from 2,000 years ago becomes quite possible in light of some of those things.
Totally. Yeah. And the more let's put it like this. The more time I've spent studying science, the more plausible faith becomes.
Yeah.
To me, personally. Again, this is not every scientist feels that way.
No. But
I have not been served poorly by that endeavor. There was a time where I was kind of like, I was going through what you might call the deconstruction, where I was like, well, what I'm too curious and I'm too frustrated with people saying you shouldn't study this, you shouldn't read this. You be careful with that field of study because you might go off the quote unquote deep end.
Not that deep end.
And let me tell you, like, and this may not, and that might be true for some folks, but at least in my personal experience, the more I read the people I wasn't supposed to read, and the more I just submitted my soul to the Spirit. I said, Spirit, one of your jobs according to the scriptures is to keep me. And so keep me. Yeah. If you're real, keep me. Yeah. And then I just studied. I read the people I wasn't supposed to read. And then I studied the sciences that I wasn't supposed to study. And what I left is like, Jesus kept rising to the surface as more compelling, more beautiful, more of a brilliant mind about how humanity should exist and all of this. We'll go figure, the creator of the universe. So
I walked away. That reminds me of?
Yeah.
Can I tell a random story that isn't mine?
Sure.
It doesn't have to get Aaron incredibly create a new button. about 6 minutes before the podcast that if I ever
we
tell a random
desperately
story,
need to use.
that we don't know, so you can play the button, I guess, even though this isn't my story.
All right, here we go. This is supposed to be after the random story, though.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Not before.
Okay,
we could do it before. Well, no, we could
just play it.
Random stories with Alex. I probably need to re-record. It's pretty quiet.
Okay. Well, anyway, I couldn't hear it, but it was actually one of our staff members, Angela, that was telling the story the other day.
Yeah.
It was at a staff meal, so you may not have heard it. But she was talking about scuba diving.
Okay.
And she was saying like she hated the ocean and deep water until she went scuba diving. And she said once I'd scuba dived, I'd seen what was down there. And I started to fall in love with like the beauty of it and how much you could see, and how much you could interact with. And so now she said, when I swim on the top or I'm on the top of the water, I'm like, no, I know that world a little bit. Now it's infinitely explorable. So there's elements that you're still learning, but the world became a familiar thing. And I sometimes think that about like the study of when people say you might fall off the deep end or something like that. I actually think sometimes reading some of the stuff that some people would say don't read actually gives you a sense of like, oh no, okay, I kind of know what's down there now. That's actually been helpful.
Totally.
Whereas I think there is a whole world that says, there's been a whole Christian point of view that says, yeah, don't read anyone that doesn't agree with what you believe already, which seems a horrible way to exist.
Yes.
Personally.
Totally. It's definitely a way to never, ever be exposed to anything but what you already are. Never be transformed. Never.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a sounding chamber. You're just like in a little box.
Totally.
You only just self-affirming sounding chamber box. Yeah.
Yeah. So if nothing else, like reading.
I don't know if that qualifies as a random story. You tied it in so beautifully.
Well, I think I tie in every story beautifully. In my mind, they always connect. There are no random stories.
Yeah. Here I am recording this little like stupid jingle, random stories with Alex. She's like, hey, I don't tell random stories.
I tell purposefully connected stories.
Speaking of random things, we're 17 minutes into our podcast. And we were having a discussion earlier about the length of our podcast and how right around 20, 25, 30 minutes into our podcast, we usually discover what the podcast is going to be about.
Hey, maybe
we're on a journey with you live.
No one ever looked at a river and said, I love that river's straight. Like rivers are supposed to meander.
We meander, and then we discover a subject matter that's exciting, and then it like takes on a life of its own. And then probably the last 30 minutes is like really, I think it's pretty good stuff. So if
you've
you're
got
the kind
another
of
5 minutes to wait before it gets pertinent.
So if you're like just totally annoyed with the first 25 minutes of our episodes, you could just fast forward to 30 minutes. Usually there's something actually good.
So continuing with Easter, Jesus dies on Good Friday, the Saturday, and Jewish holiday. Incredibly, all sorts of visitors in Jerusalem. Everything's like noise. It's like, I mean, probably the best modern example, even though it feels very different in some ways, is like something like Carnival in Rio or something like that. It's a celebration. It's the big event of the year. And yet for the disciples, of course, there's like the trauma of Jesus' death and then what comes now. Like, do they even celebrate Passover? Like, what do they even do? We don't even get a window into that. It just skips the Saturday. Do they go through the religious observances? Do they just say, like, there's no point doing anything anymore? Then Sunday comes, a couple of women go to the tomb, they find the grave, stone roll back, they hear the words from the angel, he's not here, he's risen. And then the story continues from there into what we'll now do as a community, which is Eastertide, the unfolding of the story through to Pentecost. So it is a story that requires faith to believe because it's not the normal story. Everything tells us like when death happens. I think last year, maybe at South, I told a story about, I think I accidentally ran over my own cat. It was pretty traumatic.
I don't remember that story.
I definitely told it. I'm sure I did. I came back
Was I
from
not
an early
listening?
morning prayer meeting and found my cat dead on the road. Or my parents had found it. And I'd been the only one that had left that morning, and it was pretty quiet. Now, maybe somebody else did it, but I remember like the
Like
devastation.
the screech didn't cue you in?
I didn't hear it. I didn't hear it. No.
All you cat lovers
It's
out
a
there are
great
just like
cat.
mortified.
This
We
was
just
a
got
gr-
shut off by
This
cat
was the
lovers.
best cat ever. No, I can redeem it. This was the best cat I've ever had. Wonderful cat. I don't like any of my cats I have now, but this cat was great. And I remember sitting there with the cat, and it's obviously the body's cold and started to rigor mortis. It's gone stiff. And just like saying, God, like, you can resurrect this thing. Like, I miss my cat. Like, you know, and yet, you know, like, it doesn't happen almost every time. The Jesus story is the time it does happen. At least that's what we're told, right? That's the faith that we hold. So if someone's a skeptic, like, why believe this story is different to all the other stories?
Yeah. Well, that actually, you're actually asking me
Yeah.
what I just really wanted to ask a different question, a slightly twist on the same question. But so why is this story the most compelling, or compelling even though it doesn't happen often?
Yeah.
I
love we've twisted the tables. You usually ask me the questions.
I wasn't ready.
I don't know where this came from. It's like when I stole your introduction the other week.
Yeah, I was like, what is happening? Give that back.
What happens now? This is
I think I might actually approach the answer in a different way. Which is similar to, I believe the resurrection confirms who Jesus was. It, like, there's all this evidence. You can go evidence demands a verdict, all these, whatever, like,
case for Christ.
Case for Christ. There's all this explanation. And I think that there's some really powerful historical, sociological explanations for that the resurrection happened. But for me, the reason it's so compelling has less to do with the resurrection itself, but it has to do with the teachings of Jesus before he died. Jesus painted this picture of what the kingdom could be, what human existence could look like if we follow a certain type of existence as human beings. And that is so beautiful and so different and so brilliant and so true to life. And then the resurrection sort of says, oh, and here's why he was the most qualified human, God, to give us advice about how to be human. And so the resurrection is just like this tying up of the bow. It's the most compelling story and way of being human possible. And so that's one of the reasons why the resurrection is so beautiful to me is it means that his ideas are worth trying.
Yes.
And then those become self-fulfilling. Like, you start to try the way of Jesus and experience the way of Jesus and read about the way he paints a picture of how human existence should and could exist. And then it starts to unfold. It's the most compelling.
Yeah, and I love that. And I think sometimes people say, well, I tried it. I think it was G.K. Chesterton that used to say that the way of Jesus, or Christianity, I think is the term he used, has not been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and left untried.
That's a great
like,
line.
which is just, it's just wonderful, because you occasionally run into people who are like, oh yeah, I went to church once and I prayed a prayer or something like that. But the reality is, like, apprenticing with Jesus is not the work of a moment.
Yeah, and I've had tons of people say, I grew up in the church. What are you talking about? And
Yeah.
and I tried that. It's not for me. It's not for me. It's not for me. That over and over again. That's actually, I think in America, that's the most common reaction.
Yes.
Because we're in an era where the majority of Americans, at least in middle class suburban America, have been exposed to Christianity in some way.
I
would
went to a
even
VBS once.
Yeah, I would actually venture to say, yeah, that like the majority of people kind of have some sort of exposure to it. And then they're like, yeah, it's just not for me. And my counter argument would be, I don't think you actually have been exposed to the teachings of Jesus.
Yeah.
As you've been exposed to what some group explained was the gospel to you, and most of the time they have no idea what Jesus actually taught.
Yeah.
They only know what this subgroup taught, or some nuance of it, which may have been some truth or a misunderstanding, or it was brought to them by a character that was so hostile or painful that they couldn't actually hear the message, or on and on.
And
on.
I was listening to a podcast, I think it was John Mark Comer the other day, who has a podcast almost as good as ours, I believe.
Almost.
He's a very smart guy.
They don't have random stories with Alex, so there's no way it can be quite as good, but almost as good.
Oh, Lord. Is that our strong card? Maybe that's why it's so successful. But one of the things he said that really stuck with me is he said it surprised him when he was asked to start traveling to teach. He would go to these churches, and people that had been in church for 40 years would come up to him and be like, oh my goodness, I've never heard of like the things that you're talking about. I've never heard them in 40 years of church. And he said the scary thing was what I was doing was I was talking about discipleship, apprenticing with Jesus, like taking Jesus' commands and living by them. Like he said, like, how is that something you haven't heard in 40 years in church? But he said regularly this happened. People would say, I've been around church all my life, and this has never been introduced to me in this way.
Yeah, which brings me to maybe a note. My guess is most of our listeners are followers of Jesus.
Yeah.
I'd be shocked if you aren't, and you're listening to this. Why? If you are send us a note.
They came for the quantum physics and they stayed for the theology.
Oh, wow. Okay. Maybe it's random stories with Alex. That's why they're here.
Or maybe that's why they left.
But one of the ways that I've talked about the gospel with unbelievers, I don't know how you want to describe it nowadays. Recently, that's more interesting way of having the conversation, I think, is when most people, you say, I'm a pastor or whatever, is like, hey, have you had any faith interaction? They're like, oh, yeah, it's not for me.
Yeah.
I say, oh, you've just never heard the gospel. And then I just kind of like drop the conversation. And they're like, oh, no, I know the gospel. And I'm like, no, you don't.
Yeah. Pushing some buttons.
And they're like, well, yeah, like, and they start to explain the gospel. And I was like, no, that's not it.
Yeah. There's actually,
and they're like, so then I get them to tell me the gospel.
Yeah.
And most of the time it's like a little twisted. It's not the compelling story that Jesus gives. It's whatever. And then you can just fill in the gaps. But there's been a couple times where I've said that, and then I just leave the conversation.
Yeah.
I really think,
just gonna let it.
or I'll just say, I don't think you've ever actually heard the teachings of Jesus. Usually is what I say. And I think knowing a little bit about you, I think that it would be the most compelling thing and that you would totally resonate with it. And then I just leave.
just walk off.
I actually did.
In the house.
There was one time I said all I had was like 15 minutes with this person.
And on that note,
and I said, if you're ever interested, just read the Gospels, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Those are just stay in there and live in there until you kind of get to know his actual teaching. And I think you'd be surprised. Yeah. And then I just got up from the table and walked out because I had to go to another meeting.
I love it.
I don't know if whatever happened to it, but he was kind of like, I mean, how does he not sit there and go, maybe I don't know the gospel? I don't know.
There's this evangelist guy who's, I think he's from Ireland. Someone sent me a video of him the other day, and I'd seen a few things that he'd done before, and it's not my style of talking about Jesus personally, but I love that he's talking to people about Jesus. I mean, I tried this style years ago of like being out on the streets and stopping people in the street. Never worked.
Is this the guy that's pretty hell-driven?
Yeah, I think so, probably, yeah. His name's Joe something, yeah. And anyway, but one of the things he does that made me intrigued was he does go up to people and say, I've got £20 for you if you can tell me the gospel. And people are just like, darn it, I wish I knew, because I could get £20 right now. Like you can see the frustration in the faces of like, but I think like in a society like England, or maybe Ireland, I think he's in, you could see that there's loads of people that don't even have a word familiarity with gospel. But even in church, we tend to find, I think, that a lot of people can't define the gospel outside of Jesus died to pay my sins or something like that, which is part of the gospel.
Yeah.
But not the whole thing.
Yeah. And I almost was going to ask you, all right, well, tell us the gospel. But I have a belief about the gospel that would almost be like, this is a 30-hour podcast.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the gospel is big enough to envelop all of human existence, all of current life, an explanation of everything in the past, and everything moving forward in the future.
Yeah.
The destruction, the pain, and the restoration of all of humanity. That was where you'd have to go fully.
So and broadly speaking, like.
But do you have a short version?
Well, what Jesus, it said that what we get told in the Gospels is, again, dangerous word to use. In the biographies of Jesus, is Jesus came preaching the good news of the kingdom of God.
Totally.
So any definition of the gospel has to begin with God present in the world, reigning in a particular way. Now, to get beyond that requires so much. Especially for an audience that doesn't necessarily jive well with kingship or monarchy or all of those different elements. We're like, wait, can we not say Jesus came to be president of the world or something like that? Jesus came looking for my vote. It's
not a democracy.
No, it's not.
It is not.
So
did you know that democracy is not the most biblical framework of government?
Definitely not. No.
Yeah. That's a little scary for some people out there.
Theocracy for the win.
Theocracy.
But so broadly speaking, there is an entry of God, a re-entry of God into his own world, and a reshaping of that around his kingdom now and forever. As part of that, Jesus reaches individual people and invites them to repent and return to God. And all of the forgiveness of sins that goes into that is an important part. But having a broad definition of something like gospel is really hard for us as 21st century followers of Jesus in America. And I think we experience that in church all the time.
So that's the second part of the message that you gave on Sunday. You said there's a first part, and I'm breaking this down in too simple of a terms. This is me from memory, just listening to your message. You had the part where you're saying it's plausible.
Yeah.
Like, you can be intellectually honest, scientifically astute, and still say that faith in a resurrected Jesus is plausible.
Yeah.
That's one movement.
Yeah.
And then the other movement was that it's preferable.
Yeah.
Right? Did I do a good job?
You did. That was it. That was 2 movements. That was it. Way to go. Look at that.
I hope you guys remembered it.
Possible and preferable.
Do I get extra points?
Definitely.
I'm going to get a raise.
I'm going to point at you.
All right. So, but the preferable part.
Yeah.
So the word gospel is good news. It's good news. It's like this something that would be received as good news. And so, like, go into that a little bit more, because I feel like so many people, when they've heard the gospel, it's actually come across as bad news.
Yeah, it's like, how do you make the best news ever bad? So I think one of the early seminary classes for most people is when they start to hear, maybe for the first time, that gospel isn't a new word. It's not something that the first followers of Jesus pulled out of thin air. It's got a history to it. The Jewish idea of glad tidings was, it's all over Isaiah. It's all over some of the other prophets that start to talk about God's new reign in Israel, all the things that will come out of the future. The Romans talked about gospel. The Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, was Romans would come to a town, they would threaten to destroy it, and if you just turned all the good stuff over to them and agreed to become a vassal of Rome, it was like, now you're on our side. Like, we'll bring you in. Peace.
maybe the ancient secular equivalent of an evangelist was the guy who would run across the countryside to let the ruler know that the war is over.
Yes. Yeah.
That's the event, and so he's the sprinter who carries the gospel.
Yeah, totally.
He's the evangelist with the gospel. That's like the ancient secular mindset.
The good news bringer.
Yeah.
And so those words are old words, and now as Jesus comes and starts teaching, they become the groundwork for what he's talking about, which is that God is re-entering the world. And so like that in itself is supposed to be received by people as good news. The rightful ruler now comes to reign. But as with all those other good news there's another element of like, well, what does that mean for you as an individual person? So like the Roman good news meant as a farmer just trying to make a living and sell crops, you get to keep selling crops and making a living. Like there is no war anymore. And so somewhere there's something about what God is doing in the world that says, no, for you, this is a good news. And so when we talk about like this big word atonement, for a lot of years, the central idea of atonement for the church, like what has God done for us? How has he brought us to at-one-ment? Was that you don't have to worry about death anymore. Which has been as we talked about with resurrection, has been the universal condition.
There's this nemesis that no one gets away from.
Yeah, it's like there's a few things that are insatiable, and one is the grave. And so at its simplest level, the story of the thief on the cross represents that. Like, Jesus, can't you do something about this situation, is his request. And Jesus' response is, today you'll be with me in paradise. And we talked about this on, I think, was it the week before Palm Sunday? I can't remember. But there is no other element to his faith other than the guy in the middle cross. He's the one that told me I could come. Which is just fascinating. Like that in itself is the strict, like, this is the good news that for you individually, death is defeated. And now your participation in the kingdom is not just now in this moment, it's forever and all time. Which is pretty good news when you think about it.
It is. So you said that there's some folks who would not receive that as good news. So what's not to like?
That's a great question. I'm probably not the best person to ask because I think it's good news. So there's a lack of,
I might be giving you a loaded question.
Yeah.
But
there's a surrender that's required in that story, just as there is in the Roman story.
Good job. You found the answer I was looking for.
So I
leading the witness.
Yeah. I mean, if you go back to that Roman gospel, what's the downside to saying yes to the Roman gospel? Well, it's a lack of autonomy. It's like we used to be a free and independent state, and now we're paying taxes to Rome. We're under Rome's protection. Yes, we're part of the empire, but we're not free to just do whatever we want. And there might be a Roman presence here that wasn't there before. And so there's a downside to that.
And the same reality is true in the kingdom of God. Like, you relinquish your kingdom, or you say, my kingdom is completely subservient in service to all of the resources that I think I have that were actually given to me by the king. Yeah. But all of the resources that I think I have, my gifts, my passions, my possessions, my time, my energy, my emotions, my affections, all of it is in service to the kingdom, king and the kingdom and his agenda.
And that's...
for some, they're like, yeah, that doesn't sound like a great idea. And so the one of the steps for that kind of person is they have to first confirm and believe that the king is good.
Yes.
Such a massive prerequisite for truly accepting the gospel is you have to believe that this is not your average king.
And I would say even like there's a first part to that you have to believe the king is the rightful king.
Yeah.
And the king is good.
And the king is good.
Yeah. So he has claim. Like that's an important element.
And
like,
some people might even make that mental assent, but I don't think it's that he's good.
Yeah.
So
So you need both parts of those things. And we have such an ownership mentality, especially in this nation, I think.
Yeah.
Because we're told from our earliest age, like it's so good, like create, be an owner, don't be an employee. Like Harvard Business School, the most successful, like the center of business or whatever. I'm sure there's other good ones, but what do they tell you? We're not going to teach you how to get a job. We're going to teach you how to make a job. You know, like we're not interested in getting you to a point where you can go work for someone. We're going to get you to a point where you're the one that's creating jobs. Like own stuff. Like don't lease when you can buy. Which is, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that economically. We would need an economist to be able to help us understand that element. But it can be a problem spiritually if it leads you to believe that ownership allows you to take anything out of this world.
And I think this is why Jesus said not many rich will enter the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
It's just really hard. And I recognize that I'm one of the rich.
Yeah.
Given the fact that I'm just living in America. But yeah, it's super hard when you have so much autonomy in a Western middle class sort of environment. It's super hard not to be deeply believe that I can control the outcome. Yeah.
I started dabbling in stocks for a while, and I've talked about this before, and I was bad at it, so I stopped doing it.
Well, so am I, but I won't admit it.
Yeah, won't admit that you're bad at it, or won't admit that you stopped.
I'm just dollar cost averaging in because I found out how stupid I was.
Well, I think that's the thing. Like, but that's so what I realized about why I was doing stocks, like everything I was doing was risky stock stuff. Like I was playing long odds with the hope of like a big payoff, which is fine for some people, I guess. But when I look at it, like, why was I doing that?
It's fine when it's 1% of your portfolio.
Totally, yeah,
Not
yeah,
100% of your portfolio.
Yeah, and so like I was swinging for the fences because I wanted to create wealth out of nothing.
Yeah,
and I was like, oh man, what? Like, wouldn't that be amazing? And then I started to look, like, I wasn't like investing for a future. I was like, oh, this would make me look really smart, I think. Like suddenly I'd have resources when, you know, I chose a pathway or followed a calling is probably a better way of saying it, that does provide limited resources compared to other options I had. And I feel like I did that consciously. I said yes to that because I felt like it was what God had for me. But I do remember like a divergence of like wanting to do banking. I was going to do law. Like I had some options for different career tracks. And then I said, no, I'm going to go to seminary. So like somewhere, like I feel like I accepted the path of no wealth. And then I was like, well, what if I just created it out of like brilliance in this area? And then like realizing, well, why? Like, is it because you feel like a lack of wealth says something about you, or a lack of ownership says something about you?
Huh.
Like, what's the motivation here? It was just intriguing to me. And it's I see this with like the school that my kids happen to go to is a brilliant school, but like one of the things they talk about a lot is like start a business, ownership. And I'm like, that's so interesting to me. Because ownership does definitely have its spiritual downsides if it doesn't have its sociological downsides.
Yeah.
Like if we get into that ownership mentality, it's so hard to surrender all of that stuff to the king.
Yeah, I think I've told this story maybe on the podcast before, but one time when I was a kid, I asked my dad, do you think you're ever going to be rich? And he said, no. And I was like, why not? He's like, I don't think I have the gift. And I was like, I didn't understand until years later when I realized, like, he doesn't squander his money. He just doesn't think that he is wired to steward it well. And there are some people that
Totally. I would totally agree
They
with
can be
him.
filthy rich and not be owned by it.
And I
that's a
think
rare
I've told
gift.
this story. My uncle was one of those people.
Yeah.
Like, and I think what it is this, like, I don't have a lot. I give what I try to give out of what I have. And I do believe, like, as you get more wealth, giving something becomes easier.
Yes.
Like, I think there's more free space to give. So I've heard people say that's not true. And I'm like, I don't know if I buy it. I could be wrong, but I feel like as you get more, there's some space.
Talk to Maslow.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What I think is, as you get more, like, really the calling of Jesus is not to give a percentage. Like, we've got into the habit of talking about that in church, give 10%, with the implication that you can hold 90%. And God has 10 and you get 90. And actually, the only way Jesus seems to talk about wealth and stewarding it is you have to hold all of it completely open-handed. And anything that he wants to use for his kingdom goes to his kingdom. And the more stuff you have, the harder and harder that becomes to do.
Yeah.
Because you find all of these little places to hide it away and say, no, that's mine for, like, this thing and this thing and this thing. And
that's all that is to answer that question of why might the gospel not be compelling?
Yeah.
Why might it
Yeah,
not
man,
be
we
good
really
news?
meandered on that.
If your main agenda is to control a lot of things and to advance your kingdom, the range, as Dallas Willard would say, a kingdom is just the range of your effective will.
Yeah. Your circle of influence is a way I've described it at some
exactly.
point.
It's how far where you want to have something happen can actually happen.
Mm-hmm.
How much influence do you have in the world? And so if you really want that to be preserved and sustained and whatever, eventually the gospel can't be good news to you. You have to eventually get to the place where you're like, actually, God's ideas or God's kingdom is better than mine, and I surrender to him, his way, his reign, it starts to get a little closer to home.
Yeah.
And I would venture to say that can be a progressive journey.
Yeah.
Which is why we continue to talk about surrender over and over and over.
I don't know if I'll be able
churches.
to dig it out, but I actually did a week on stewardship. And there was this quote that intrigued me because it seemed to, like, land perfectly on the, oh man, like, this is where you're like, I wish I had everything organized better than I think I do. Might just have to be for another day. Broadly speaking, not verbatim, he said, like, where stewardship is harder than ownership is that both can come with resources, but ownership maintains control of the resources. And a stewardship mindset of what you have demands that you surrender control without surrendering responsibility. That's so difficult. You're actually saying to another one, you decide. So the more stuff you have, the bigger your house, the more you have to decide. And I think I joked the other day, like, I found this jacket for $40 that was $700. And it would be easier for me to give away a $700 jacket if I just had $700 to buy a new jacket, I think. But because I got it for $40, I'm like, I'll never find another one of these for $40.
Yeah.
Like, the more stuff you get, the harder
and he's
it is.
not lying because he keeps telling the story about this jacket. So he's so proud of himself.
I love a bargain. It's an English thing.
He gets so excited. It's amazing.
English people are like Indians in this respect. An Indian person invented the number 0 or discovered the number 0. And one comedian said it's because they looked at all the other numbers and said, none of those is the number I want to pay for anything. Like, I need a number that describes what I want to pay. 0. There it is. English people are very similar to Indian people in that respect.
That's awesome. That's a great line. So
do we circle back to resurrection or to quantum physics?
No, I think we could probably tie it up and just say, okay, the gospel, it's good news, it's compelling, so it's plausible, it's preferable, maybe. We're recommending it as preferable, but if we've described about how maybe the good news could be hard news for some.
But I do think
it's invasive news.
Yeah.
To our own kingdom.
But an invite is always, and this is an invite that's good for you and I, and for anyone that's been following Jesus for years, is to regularly reappraise, Jesus, how well am I doing following your way of living? What would you teach me in this season? Like, how in this season can I learn to follow you better? And that comes with some scary results sometimes.
Yeah, and so maybe the pastoral like recommendation is to say, you can progressively surrender.
Yeah.
The one thing I would recommend you don't do is just tap out altogether because one issue became difficult. And just say, all right, Lord, what do you want me to surrender this time? And then dip your toes in the water and then progressively surrender. And I think, partially because I've been doing this for a while and discovering the way of Jesus, and all along the way, he's proven himself like, I think I'm right, but I'm going to try your way. Oh, dang it, he was right again. Turns out Jesus is right again and again and again. And
Jesus.
Not because, and at each turn, it's because it's good for me.
Yeah.
Like his kingdom is actually the best kingdom for your kingdom.
Yes.
Ultimately. Anyway, so that's maybe the pastoral nudge.
Way to bring it home.
Don't tap out if it's just a hard one.
I love it.
Is that okay?
I love it. Great to see you guys. This week we start a new series on relationships, and you're teaching in a couple of weeks. It's kind of exciting. I love that now you're committed to it because I said it on the podcast.
Oh man, I was telling him before the episode started. Yeah, I agreed to teach, and then now the subject matter is like growing and it's becoming more daunting, and it's like this monster in my closet.
That means we get to switch podcast roles as well. I get to ask you all the questions.
Yeah, and I told you that the only reason I was preaching is because I could tell everyone what not to do because I've already done it all. I've done everything poorly, and I could tell them what not to do.
I love it. See you guys.
We'll catch you next time on the Red Couch Theology podcast.
The Red Couch Quantum Physics podcast.
Oh, I love it. We should start a second podcast. All right, we should probably turn this off now. Oh, I didn't even pull up our thing to shut it off. So you guys are going to just have to watch me sit here and push buttons, log into accounts. Well, I was too busy creating my jingle. Bye.